sufficient assumption questions are kind of formal logic in nature, or at least you can often frame them that way. And so, unlike most logical reasoning, I actually will want to diagram these. So I'm going to pull up the PDF now with the slides, and we'll go through these a little bit together. So first off, you want to be able to properly identify a sufficient assumption question as compared to a necessary assumption question. So there are certain key indicator words that tell you that you're dealing with a sufficient assumption. And those are words and phrases like properly drawn if assumed, an assumption that would make the conclusion a logical one, or follows logically if assumed. So words and phrases that are synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, properly inferred if assumed. Those all indicate that you're dealing with a sufficient assumption question specifically, which is looking for new information that, if true, will guarantee the argument 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all. So it's the key word or phrase in the question stem. In particular here, follows logically if assumed is a very common phrase telling you this. So again, how to ID them? You have the word assumption alone isn't enough. It's these words also, the key verb or phrase, allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and you're looking to guarantee the conclusion's validity 100% by linking the evidence to the conclusion. And there are a variety of different ways to go about this. Now, like I said, there are several different formulas that you can use when looking to solve a sufficient assumption question. And the way the stimulus is laid out will lend itself towards one or more of these formulas. It won't necessarily give you the answer, but it'll give you a direction in which you might want to look. So here are several of them. The first is a restatement or broadening of the argument or conclusion, which sounds surprisingly simple because that's like saying, given X requires Y, if you learned as new information, X requires Y, that would guarantee the specific case. So seems incredibly simple. Obviously, with LSAT's language, they can make it a lot more complex, a lot trickier, and we'll get into examples. You could also have the contrapositive, because if the contrapositive is true, then the original is also true. Or we could impose new sufficient conditions that guarantee the argument, or we could link things together in various ways. And I'm not going to just lecture it now because I think it'll become a lot more clear with the diagrams, with the examples. But this is an overview. There are 6 formulas laid out here. Number 6 is actually takes a couple of different forms. So I lay it out as 6A and 6B in the following slides, which is why I would say there's maybe 7 of them altogether. Now, the first one, restatements. If we had a conclusion or an argument saying A requires B, if we learned as new information that A requires B, that would guarantee the specific case. It sounds incredibly simple, but it actually can happen. So, for example, if we have an argument saying, I will ace the LSAT because I studied, the evidence there is, if I study, conclusion, I will ace the LSAT. So studying requires or guarantees acing the LSAT. So you could draw that conditionally, study, arrow, ace the LSAT. Evidence conclusion relationships can be framed as conditional statements. So if we learned as new information that anyone who studies will ace the LSAT as a general principle, that would guarantee the specific case in the argument. Another example I've given in the past is if we have a particular scenario where we're claiming that my dog always chases your cat. If we learned as a general principle that any dog will chase any cat given the opportunity, that would guarantee the specific case. So a general principle can guarantee a specific application or specific scenario. Sounds really simple, but again, that general vague versus specific is what can make it a little bit trickier. Any questions on this or anything I've said up to this point? All right, let's look at the next one. Next one is dealing with the contrapositive. So if we have an argument or a conclusion saying A requires B, if we learn as new information that not B requires not A, again, that would guarantee the particular case in the stimulus. And since contrapositives are logically equivalent to the original, if formula number one was valid or made sense to guarantee sufficient assumptions, then the contrapositive would do the exact same thing. So again, if we have stimulus, I will ace the LSAT because I studied. If we learn as new information that anyone who doesn't ace the LSAT must not have studied, that would guarantee the particular case. And so I'll put this in the chat as well, just in case that's helpful to illustrate it a little bit more. So stimulus, studying, requires you to ace the LSAT if we learn as new information. If you didn't ace the LSAT, then you must not have studied, or put more broadly, anyone who doesn't ace the LSAT must not have studied. That would guarantee the particular case as well. Any questions on this one? All right, let's go to the third one. This is where...
Actually, hi, sorry, Steve.
Yeah, sure, go ahead, please.
Yes, it's Virginia. Sorry, it says Angelica, but my daughter's name was on the...
Yeah, sure, Virginia.
Yeah, is there... the contrapositive kind of hangs me up a little bit. What is like a more simplified way to get it into your mind? Like, I know that this obviously stating it out and spelling it out, but there like a different manner that I can tell it to myself so that I don't get a little bit confused when I'm transposing the information?
Yeah, well, I would say practice. Practice until it becomes automatic. You don't want to be thinking it through for the first time on test day or under timed conditions, because it is mathematical. And if math doesn't come naturally to you, which it doesn't to many pre-law students, you certainly wouldn't be alone on that one with dealing with the formal logic and manipulation. I would say mainly it's all about practice. And I have plenty of lessons in the course on this. Very simply put, you reverse the variables around the arrows and you negate both of them. So if we have, for example, if we have as given, if I eat pizza, then I will be happy. So that's pizza, arrow, happy, and I'm putting this in the chat here. If we take the contrapositive, we reverse the variables around the arrow and negate both. What do we get? Does somebody who feels good about the contrapositive want to take this one?
What was it again? What was your question?
Well, so I'm asking about the contrapositive here with what the example I gave. If I eat pizza, then I will be happy. So P, arrow, H. Take the contrapositive by reversing and negating. I see Carney
put... If you're not happy, then you didn't eat pizza.
Yeah, awesome, Marie. You got it. And I see Carney put that in the chat as well. Not happy, then not pizza. So the given was eating pizza guarantees that I will be happy. So if you see me not being happy, then by definition, I must not have eaten pizza, because pizza alone would have been enough to make me happy no matter what. So the example here in the more abstract version for number 2, A requires B is given. If you want to get the contrapositive, you could say not B requires not A. So reversing them around the arrow. So if A requires B, then the absence of B must mean that you didn't have A, because having A there would have forced you to have B.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
No, of course. Thank you for asking. It's an important topic. And I have some lessons on this in the course, but I'm also going to cover the contrapositive in depth with tons of examples in a class in a few weeks as well to go into that more.
I had a question, Steve.
Sure.
As far as, because I was just going to wait till you got through all of them and then ask my question. If you would like me to do that, that's fine. I had a question about the restatement. But I was
sure, please.
Gonna wait to, because there's a specific thing where in your study schedule, it had a link to sufficient assumption questions, and then it grouped them together by what you're going through right now. And yeah, I'm like, oh, I got this. It's restatement. That's easy. When I was looking through them, I'm like, wait a minute. The one I chose was the right one, but I didn't see it as a restatement. And I tried to diagram, and I still didn't see it as a restatement. So it could have been something with my diagram, or I don't know, but yeah, it's like I got it right, but I just didn't see it as it. And I don't want me to do another problem and then, the same thing happens.
That's a good question. Yeah. So first off, of course, these are the ideal types. These are the simplest, purest forms of these formulas, of these logical structures. LSAC has a million different ways to dress it up, to make it more complicated. So they might require you to do contrapositives just to get to a point where it looks clean. Or they might make it a tough scientific topic, for example, with lots of advanced vocabulary, multisyllabic words. They might use words like unless, except, until, without. So there are lots of ways they can dress it up. And then you have to peel back those layers to see what's at the core.
Yeah, because I when I did it, again, it's like I got it right, but I didn't see it as a restatement. I looked through it. The one I thought was the restatement was the wrong one, and I knew it was wrong because it didn't clear up the gap, but or I'm sorry, it didn't mend the gap, but it just, I don't know, I just didn't see it as a restatement. And later on, I guess I can give you an example of what I mean, but I want you to continue.
Yeah, sure. No, sure. Yeah. I mean, some of the questions can get really tough, and it's all about how you frame it. But I'm asking folks, when you're going through sufficient assumptions, using that list, by the way, which is the same list I linked in the chat. So what you're talking about, for those curious, I put that in the chat there, and I'll put it again before we wrap up for this evening, and I'll link it with the video of this as well. But the idea is that when you're looking at a new sufficient assumption question, see if perhaps you can put it within one of these categories. Because if you can, it'll make it a lot more manageable, because at least you have a framework. Kind of like in logic games, you have ordering, grouping, combinations. If you see a new game and you can relate it back to one of those previous ones you've done, it'll make it seem at least a little bit more manageable. And obviously, not every game fits into one category neatly. There may be some sufficient assumption questions that don't even fit to any one of these 6 or 7 categories, but many of them will, probably most of them will. And if you could see that, all the better. This one is where the conditionals get a bit more interesting. This is what I call the sufficient condition of the argument, meaning that the sufficient assumption is simply the sufficient condition of an argument, the sufficient condition of a chain. And so learning that new variable actually occurs, like in this case, A or B or C. What that can do for you is that can activate the chain and guarantee the conclusion. So if we were given as evidence, A requires B, requires C, requires D, and the conclusion was D, what would it take to guarantee D? Well, if we learned that any one of A, B, or C was true or given as new information, when combined with that chain, it would tell you, well, A activates the chain. If we learned that we had A, then that whole domino effect on the evidence chain would occur, and the conclusion of D would be guaranteed 100% with no ambiguity. Of course.
Good question.
Yeah,
Steve.
sure. Yeah, please, Daniel.
Will they try and trick us by saying, okay, here's an answer that says, okay, we've guaranteed B, whereas that's a link in the chain, but not necessarily the activating factor?
That's a great question. So B would be enough to do it. But in practice, A is a more elegant solution because it requires the entire chain to occur. It includes as many parts of that chain as possible. So they're likely to want to make you have linked all of those together. Like if they made the answer B or they made the answer C, then parts A and B would have been irrelevant to deriving the solution, and they want to make you link all of those together. And they're not likely to give it to you simply as A requires B, requires C, requires D. They're actually going to include, they're going to require some manipulation. They're going to give you the conditional separately. They may require you to take the contrapositive to force you to link everything together. So they're not going to give it to you like this in a more difficult question. They're actually going to give it to you as separate conditionals or separate clauses and force you to link them first before you even get to this point. But technically, B and C are valid. They're simply not likely to actually be the answer. Although if you didn't see A there, they could be the answer. So good question. Thank you for that. Other questions on this one?
So Steve, what you're saying here is that basically A triggers D, even though there's this like intermediary support.
Exactly. Yeah. So A.
Okay. And I like, this is a strategy for sufficient assumption questions, but the visual is really helping me understand possibly like arguments in terms of just conclusion and evidence-based logical reasoning questions in general. Like, sort of linkage between these passages, perhaps, I mean, the sentences in the passage.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and this is part of why getting conditionality down is so valuable, because it does make it a lot more clear, and it's allowing you to get past all the complex language in the stimulus and get to the core of the logic underlying it. And like the contrapositive, this sort of conditionality comes up a lot in games too. And so any understanding you make here will also help you out there too.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And so as an example here of what an argument like that could look like, I've put together an example. I'll put it in the chat as well. Staying on that same topic from the previous examples, if we have a longer conditional chain saying, if you study hard, then you'll ace the LSAT, then you'll get into Harvard Law, then you'll have a successful career. Conclusion, you've had a successful career. What would be enough to activate that, to guarantee that? What new information, when combined with that conditional chain, would guarantee that conclusion?
So you're saying if you study hard.
Exactly. So studying hard would be the most elegant solution here because it would involve the entire chain. So if we learned as new information that you study hard, that will guarantee the entire chain. Studying hard, then you ace the LSAT, then you get into Harvard Law, then you have a successful career. And learning as new information that you ace the LSAT, that would also be enough, but it wouldn't involve the study hard variable. And they want to test your ability to link that in to create this ABCD chain in the first place. Very nice. So let's go to number 4. And this one is very similar to the previous example. It just takes a slightly different form. So here, the evidence chain looks pretty much the same, but they're asking you to justify a different conclusion. Rather than asking you to justify D, which was the end of the evidence chain, they're now asking you to justify not A. So the negation of the first variable in that evidence chain. So I've given you a little help here by giving you the contrapositive. If you take the contrapositive of that evidence chain to get not D requires not C, requires not B, requires not A, conclusion not A, then what you get is pretty much the same thing as the previous example. So you want to ask yourself what new information would kick off that entire chain. Same as the previous, just looks a little bit different because it's negative this time. Anybody want to tell me the answer?
Not D.
Exactly. So if we learned that not D was true, that would then activate that entire contrapositive chain, leading to the conclusion of not A. Same thing. And so an example here would be, again, with the same theme as before. If you study hard, then you ace the LSAT, then Harvard Law, then successful career. Conclusion, not studying hard, you've got to do the contrapositive. And then what would the sufficient assumption be in this case? Just got to do the contrapositive of that entire chain. Yeah, I see. So Carney's got it. Not successful career. Exactly. So if we take the contrapositive of this example, it's if not successful career, then not Harvard Law, then not ace the LSAT, then not study hard. So the conclusion, not study hard, simply what you're looking for is the activation of that conditional, not successful career, kicks off that entire domino effect. So let's go to number 5 now. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated even than the previous examples. So here we've got multiple conditional statements where we're linking the evidence pieces together to prove or justify the conclusion. So evidence is A requires B. Then we have a second evidence, C requires D. Conclusion is A requires D. So lots of conditionals here. And what we want to do is justify this last part, A requires D specifically. That's what our objective here. But the evidence pieces don't get the job done. But they're almost there. What we've got to do in this particular case is link the evidences together, and I've put it here, B requires C. So if we were to think about there being a new arrow connecting evidence number 1 to evidence number 2, then they would form a longer chain. A requires B, requires C, requires D. And then A requires D would be fully justified, no ambiguity. So here we've got to impose that new arrow. the answer itself is a new conditional statement. And of course, the contrapositive would also work as well. So if B requires C is enough to guarantee that conclusion, then the contrapositive, not C, requires not B, would also achieve that same objective. And I've got an example here for this one as well. So if we have evidence number one, if you study hard, then you ace the LSAT, and a separate evidence statement, if you go to Harvard Law, then you'll have a successful career. And our goal is to justify the conclusion, if you study hard, then you'll have a successful career. Again, two evidence pieces that are separate, they're not linked in any way, but the conclusion has a variable from the first evidence and a variable from the second evidence. So what would be a sufficient assumption that guarantees this conclusion here, given the evidence?
If you ace the LSAT, you'll go to Harvard.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. So you got it, James. And I see Solomon wrote it to me also. Ace the LSAT and Harvard Law. That's exactly it. So that's a new conditional that links the end of the first evidence to the beginning of the second evidence. We're imposing a new conditional statement here that gets the job done. That's the key here, is that you have to be willing to open up to imposing new information. But when you do, it works. Now, of course, they might not give things to you this cleanly. They might have given you, for example, evidence might be not B requires not A. Evidence number two might still be C requires D. Either one, either formulation will work. You just have to manipulate it a little bit to get it this clean. And then as Solomon wrote, also not Harvard Law requires not acing the LSAT would also do the job. That would be the not C arrow not B formulation of this. And by the way, on test day or even as you're practicing, I wouldn't actually use the letters A, B, C, D. I'm just doing that to give it to you in a more ideal type form. In practice, you want to use the actual letters related to the variables of what you're dealing with. So for study hard, I might write SH. For acing the LSAT, I might just write A for ace. For Harvard, I might write H. Successful career, SC. I would keep it specific to the topic rather than forming more layers of abstraction here. Any questions on this one?
I do have a question.
Sure.
I wonder if I could be diagramming too much. I know in one of your videos you were talking about, you don't always have to diagram, but I figure, I should be able to diagram, one of the problems I did was for prep test 22, section 4. And I'm looking at it now and I don't know, I think I'm getting, not that I got my abbreviations wrong, it's just the diagram just didn't help me. And I got it right off instinct, but I know I shouldn't always, depend on instinct because I might be in a situation where that doesn't help. But the diagram is, I use, the letters from the words given, but I don't know if I was just missing something because it wasn't clicking.
Was it a sufficient assumption question?
Yes, it was sufficient assumption, and I believe it was under restatement. And I might not have needed the diagram, but I tried to see if I could use a diagram, but it didn't help.
Yeah, diagramming is a tool, but I wouldn't always use it. Even for sufficient assumption questions, I'm showing you these diagrams so that it's a tool you have available to you when you might want to use it. And for some simpler questions or for some restatement questions, I don't actually think it's a great idea to actually be diagramming. I'm simply showing you that is one way to think about it in terms of its underlying logical structure. I think diagramming. Yeah,
I was just trying to use it as an practice is mostly what it was with diagramming, because in other problems where I did have to diagram, like there was a lot of, elements into it. And it was just getting too much, where one of them was dealing with like chains, and I don't know, I just got messed up with the diagram, like wordage. I don't know. But yeah, it's just, I was going off of instinct, and I told myself I shouldn't. I should be able to diagram it and see it.
Listen, if it helps you, great. For the restatement category, I actually wouldn't diagram it that often.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it can be really difficult given how LSAC words things. So if it's not helping you for the restatement category, don't bother doing it there. I think it's actually much more useful for the other categories, specifically categories 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. But
Now,
categories 1 and 2, I wouldn't bother.
How would you know that it's that unless you go into the answer choices? Like, how do you know it's a restatement question?
Based on how the stimulus is laid out. So you see here for number 5, the stimulus has multiple conditionals going on.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, all we've got is one conditional here, or
Mm-hmm.
it's simply evidence arrow conclusion. So there aren't several conditionals here, and maybe depending on how you think about number 2 or number 1, it may not even be a single conditional. It could simply be evidence requires conclusion, which I would say can be framed as a conditional, but it may not come naturally to you to think of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
It might just be this because that. Is that a conditional or not? Depends on how you think about it. But it's not the sort of thing that people would automatically diagram.
Yeah, there were definitely some that weren't restatements, but that, gave, I did a conditional with it and it was right, but I'm like, there were no, what do you call it? Not activators, but indicator words. There were no indicator words to let you know that it was conditional, but it could be a conditional.
Right, yeah.
I saw other people and stuff using them as conditionals, and I was like, but there were no indicator words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There aren't always going to be indicator words, but in a case like restatement, you don't need to think about it in terms of conditionality. But for one like number 5 here, I would say it's definitely useful to do so.
Okay.
No, thank you for asking that. All right, so let's go to number 6. And this is really what I think is one of the most common categories here, what I call linking the necessary conditions. So here we have 2 conditionals, 1 evidence conditional, 1 conclusion conditional. And we have the same variable in the sufficient condition of both. And we're looking to impose a new conditional statement that, when combined with the evidence, will guarantee the conclusion. Anybody want to take a stab at this one?
As long as you suggest E and F are the same, then D guaranteeing one will guarantee the other.
Nice. Yeah, excellent. So you said as long as E and F are the same, but let's think about more specifically in terms of conditionality. Which way does that go? Because when you say the same, I'm thinking equal sign. I see Annie also wrote this, E requires F. I saw another comment saying F requires E, but actually the ordering specifically is E requires F that works. And here's why. If we have D requires E, and then we add a new conditional saying E requires F, that forms a longer chain guaranteeing D arrow E arrow F, and D to F is then fully justified. So here we go. D requires E, D requires F. Sufficient assumption number 1 here is E requires F. And I'll type in the chat that we've got D arrow E arrow F. So if we have D to E from the evidence, E to F from the sufficient assumption, it forms a longer chain, D to E to F. And yes, Alyssa, the sufficient assumption contrapositive, not F requires, not E, would also work. The contrapositive of a sufficient assumption always works as a sufficient assumption as well, because contrapositives are equivalent to the original. So here we are linking the necessary conditions. So I think about this as a circle. I think about a circle around these 4 variables, these 2 conditional statements, when laid out in this way, evidence on top, conclusion on bottom. So I think of it as a circle, and I link the parts that are different going clockwise. So E is at about 1 o'clock, F is at 5 o'clock. We're looping around E to F as our new sufficient assumption. So the answer will be E to F in the answer choices, but if you don't see that, then look for not F, arrow, not E, because of course that's logically equivalent. Any questions on this one?
I have a question.
Sure.
So is the directionality supposed to be E to F because F is already in the conclusion and F is the necessary condition of D? Is that why it goes that way?
Correct. Yeah. And if we think about it, if we learned that F requires E, it just wouldn't get the job done. We would have D requires E. We would also have F requires E. But how do those two things together tell us D requires F? It doesn't. It just tells us two separate variables that are independently sufficient to guarantee E.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not doing anything for us in terms of guaranteeing that conclusion. So it's nice information, but it just doesn't get the job done, unfortunately. And here specifically, again, is why E to F works. We have D to E from the evidence. We have E to F as our new sufficient assumption, and together they form a longer chain, D to E to F. And the sufficient assumption, the contrapositive, pretty much does the same thing as well. We just have to rearrange it first. Now we have 6b, which is the other formulation of this, which is a little bit more complicated. For some reason, it's a little bit tougher for folks to grasp typically. And this is logically equivalent to 6a. It just looks different because this time the necessary conditions are the same. But if you took the contrapositive of the evidence and conclusion, you would then have not B as the beginning of each chain. So you would then have the sufficient conditions the same like the previous, but here we don't. So again, we're linking the parts that are different. If we imagine these four variables as a circle, going clockwise, linking the parts that are different, going from C at about, let's say 7 o'clock to A, which is at 11 o'clock, C requires A would get the job done. If we learned as new information C requires A, that combined with the evidence A requires B would form a longer chain, C arrow A arrow B, and then the conclusion of C to B would be justified. And then its contrapositive, of course, would also work.
So in that case, is C just like new evidence, or it's actually part of a conclusion?
C to A is new information. So we're not imposing just the letter C alone. We're imposing a new conditional statement as new information. Because they're asking us for sufficient assumption, what new information, when combined with the evidence, would guarantee the conclusion. So the new information, in some cases, it was a single variable, like in some of the previous formulas. In categories 6A and 6B, it's a new conditional statement itself. So it's specifically this part of the chain that I've just highlighted here. C requires A, if given to us as a sufficient assumption, combined with the already given A requires B, then forms a longer chain, C to A to B. And then the conclusion as a result is fully justified. But specifically, they're asking us only for the sufficient assumption portion, C requires A.
Mm-hmm. And those will be our answer choices, yep.
Yeah, so that will be the answer choice. If you don't see C requires A, then look for its contrapositive, not A requires not C. And that's one way they increase the difficulty level of the question, is not giving it to you cleanly, giving it to you in the contrapositive formulation, which is another layer removed, another step that you have to take in the process. Any questions on this one?
Yeah, I have a question. So I think I mixed up for the linking necessary conditions and linking sufficient conditions, the directionality, because I had this one in mind when I was diagramming the other one. And I would like to know why would A requires C not work then?
This is a very common question. I get this one all the time, and I actually put together another slide for that exact reason. So why doesn't A to require C serve as a sufficient assumption? Because people always look for that. And you might think, well, again, people like to think we're going down. That just seems like a more natural direction, like going down from A to C in this case here. But the reason it doesn't work is because if you had A requires C as a sufficient assumption, and you already had the given evidence, A requires B, you would then get a longer chain simply telling you A requires both B and C. But A requiring both B and C doesn't tell you anything about how C and B relate to each other in a conditional sense. It just doesn't tell you anything about that relationship. You can't infer from this that C requires B. They're not logically equivalent. So it just simply doesn't do that. And so with an example here, let's say that the evidence was A requires B. If it's an apple, then it's a fruit. And then we had our proposed sufficient assumption. If it's an apple, then it's food. Would that tell us that all food is fruit? No, it would simply tell you that an apple happens to be both fruit and food in general, but it doesn't tell you anything about how food and fruit relate to each other in a conditional sense. It's kind of like when people say for a flaw question, why isn't such and such the flaw? And it's like, well, flaws are bad, but if an argument isn't guilty of a particular flaw, then that choice doesn't describe the flaw the argument's guilty of committing. Great question. I'm glad you asked it because people ask that one all the time. Other questions on this category? So another topic that comes up a lot is telling the difference between necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions. So I thought I would end off this session by talking just a little bit about the difference, because people are always saying to me, I have trouble with assumption questions, or I have trouble telling the difference between them. And the key, again, is the verb or phrase in the question stem, not simply the word assumption. Necessary assumption questions have words and phrases synonymous with necessity, the most common being depends upon, requires, and assumes. Sufficient assumption questions have words and phrases synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and properly inferred if assumed. The key word here being if in those phrases. The key word being if is your sufficient indicator, or your synonym for sufficiency. So focus on that to tell the difference. They're asking for completely different things. Everything we've been doing here with regard to diagramming for sufficient assumptions, I would not do for necessary assumption questions. Sufficient assumption questions open the door to new information. Which one of the following, if true, guarantees the argument 100%, leaving no ambiguity? Necessary assumption questions, on the other hand, are simply asking for what needs to be the case if you take the argument as given. So I think of necessary assumption questions as being a very specific kind of must be true question. And so again, just illustrating the difference here, necessary assumption questions, I think of them more as informal logic, and you're looking for something that must be true for the argument to work, but that necessary assumption does not have to be enough to guarantee the argument all the way. Alternatively, sufficient assumption questions are opening the door to new information that may not need to be true for the argument to work, but if it is true, the conclusion is guaranteed 100%.
Can you give an example of the necessary, where you say that it doesn't have to guarantee it? It must be true, but doesn't have to guarantee it.
Yeah, sure. So if you want to buy a $100 item, having the value of $1 is required, but $1 alone isn't going to be enough to buy the $100 item. If you tell me you bought a $100 item, I know that you had at least the value of $1. Now you had more naturally, but I know that you had at least $1. On the other hand, having $1,000 is enough to buy a $100 item, but it's not required in order to do so.
Yeah, I had a question where I was down to two options, and I wanted to go with the one that was actually right, but then I was thinking to myself, it seemed more like a necessary answer choice, where it was like if I negated it, it would destroy the argument. So I'm thinking like, no, that can't be it, because, I know sufficient is supposed to guarantee it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be enough. But it was actually the right answer. So yeah, I don't know about that one.
We'd have to look at it, and feel free to send it over. But
okay.
The thing with these questions and the distinction between them is that they're really good at putting tempting wrong answers before the correct one. So a lot of times for a necessary assumption question, they'll put a very tempting sufficient assumption answer choice before the correct answer. So it's very important to approach these from the proper perspective.
And if I can add to that just really quick,
Sure.
Sufficient assumption questions can be absolutely crazy. Like if the conclusion is a moderate one, but then you've got a answer choice that, for example, the conclusion says sum of whatever, 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 a answer choice that says all of everything in its entire history of the universe is whatever, then that is perfectly valid as a sufficient assumption because it's going overkill. Overkill doesn't necessarily disqualify an answer for a sufficient assumption question is what I'm getting at. It can be super crazy and super strongly worded.
That's absolutely right, James. Thanks for that. Yeah, it doesn't matter how extreme it is, as long as it gets the job done. Anything in that category where you're opening the door to new information, like strengthen, weaken, sufficient assumption, doesn't matter how strong it is. It could be way more than you need, like buying a $100 item. If you had $1 million, that would be enough. If you had $1 trillion, that would be enough. The question is it enough? Not is it required? And my example for this is killing a mosquito with a nuclear warhead. It's overkill, but it will achieve that objective. You could have less too, though, but that would be enough.
I like that one.
Yeah, thank you. All right, folks, any other questions on sufficient assumptions for this evening? Or the difference between necessary and sufficient? All right, well, if nothing else here, I want to thank you all for joining. We've got the student-led study session coming up in about 15 minutes. Feel free to head over there early. The link to that is in the email I sent you all about 45 minutes ago. And I'll see you all soon. I did add another class to the agenda. You may have gotten the email already. I'm going to do another personal statement workshop this Thursday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. So please feel free to join for that. A couple of you have sent me personal statement drafts already. Please feel free to send over more and I'll add them to the agenda. We may not get to all of them on Thursday, but I will be adding more of those sessions in the coming weeks so that we get to everybody's personal statements before it's time to apply. And if you have other requests for future sessions or classes, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to consider them and add them to the agenda. But have a good night all, and I'll see you all very soon. Thanks for joining. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.